My stepmother crossed her legs, adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist, and smiled at the lawyer across the mahogany conference table. "Just to be clear," she said, "James has nothing. My husband's estate goes entirely to me and to my son David. James was estranged from his father for the last 6 years of his life. He wasn't even at the funeral. He didn't earn a single dollar of what's in this room." The lawyer, a man named Harold Grierson, who had represented my father for 31 years, looked up from the file in front of him. He looked at my stepmother. He looked at me. Then he looked back down at the file, and he did something very strange. He turned to the second page. He read for about 11 seconds. He turned to a third page, a page that was on a different type of paper, cream-colored and stamped with a blue seal I could see from across the table. He looked up again. He said, "Mrs. Whitfield, before we proceed, I need to ask your stepson a question." He turned to me. He said, "Mr. Whitfield, when was the last time you spoke to your father?" I opened my mouth to answer, and that is when I realized my stepmother had made the worst mistake of her life: the estrangement. "My name is James Whitfield. I am 37 years old. I served 12 years in the United States Marine Corps, most of it in a job I still cannot fully describe to my closest friends. I retired in 2022 as a Chief Warrant Officer 3 and moved to a small cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains outside of Asheville, North Carolina, where I have lived quietly for the last 3 years, with a rescue dog named Cooper and a garden that grows more weeds than vegetables. I did not attend my father's funeral in September. I know how that sounds. I know exactly how that sounds. And I know that everyone in that conference room in Charleston, South Carolina, on the second Tuesday of November, believed exactly what my stepmother told them: that I was the ungrateful son, the estranged son, the son who had turned his back on his father in his final years. They were wrong. My father was Colonel Robert James Whitfield. He served 34 years in the United States Marine Corps. He fought in Beirut in 1983. He fought in the Gulf. He commanded a battalion in Fallujah in 2004 when I was in high school. He retired in 2011 as one of the most decorated officers of his generation, and he moved home to Charleston to a house on Sullivan's Island that had been in the Whitfield family for 4 generations. He met my stepmother, Caroline Preston, at a Charleston Symphony Gala in 2013. She was a widow. She was elegant. She had a son named David, 22 years old, from her previous marriage. Within 8 months, they were engaged. Within a year, they were married. I was 25 years old at the time. I was on my second tour in Afghanistan. I flew home for the wedding on a 72-hour pass, wore my dress blues, danced with my mother's college roommate, and flew back to Kandahar the next morning. My mother had died of ovarian cancer in 2009. She had been sick for 4 years. My father had loved her every day of those 4 years. He was allowed to remarry. I did not resent Caroline. I did not resent David. I was happy for my father because he was the kind of man who did not know how to be alone. For the first 3 years, everything was fine. Caroline was polite to me. She wrote me letters at my duty stations. She sent Christmas cards. When I was home on leave, she cooked for me and asked me about my career and made sure my father and I had time alone together in the study to talk about, to talk about the things Marines talk about with other Marines when they are the only 2 people in the room. And then, in the summer of 2018, something changed. I was home on leave in July of that year. My father took me out on the boat, a small 22-foot Grady White he kept at a marina in Mount Pleasant. We went out into the harbor. We fished for about an hour without catching anything. And then he cut the engine, turned to me, and he said, "James, I need to tell you something, and I need you to not react." He told me he had been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's disease. He told me it had been caught early. He told me he had 10 to 15 good years ahead of him. He told me he did not want Caroline to know yet, because Caroline had lost her first husband to a long illness, and he did not want her to spend the next 15 years mourning him while he was still alive. He asked me to keep it quiet. I did. 6 months later, in January of 2019, he called me from Charleston. I was stationed at Camp Lejeune at the time. He asked me to drive down for the weekend. I did. He took me into his study. He closed the door. He sat me down in the leather chair across from his desk. The chair where he had once, when I was 17 years old, told me he was proud of me for enlisting. He said, "James, I've done something, and I want to tell you about it before anyone else finds out." He had, 6 weeks earlier, established a trust. He called it the Whitfield Legacy Trust. It was funded with a portion of his retirement, a portion of a life insurance policy my mother had taken out on him in 1998, and the entirety of a small commercial real estate holding my grandfather had left him in 1987. The trust was substantial. He would not tell me the exact amount that day, but he told me it was, his words, enough. The trust had one beneficiary, me. He told me why. He told me he had watched Caroline over the last 5 years. He told me she was a good woman in many ways, but he had begun to notice things. Small things. She had started opening his mail. She had started asking questions about his investments. She had, in October of 2018, quietly transferred the deed on the Sullivan's Island house into joint ownership without telling him, which he had only discovered when the annual tax statement arrived in his name and hers. He said, "James, I am going to leave your stepmother very well provided for. She will not want for anything, but I am not going to let her take what your grandfather built. That belongs to a Whitfield. That's you." He made me the trustee and the beneficiary. He signed the papers. Harold Grierson, the same lawyer who would, 5 years later, sit across a mahogany conference table from Caroline Preston Whitfield, witnessed the signature. My father asked me one thing. He asked me not to tell Caroline. Not yet. Not until after I gave him my word. I kept it. For 6 years. The Cold War one want to explain how a Marine keeps a promise like that, because it is not what most people assume. I did not stop calling my father. I did not disappear. For the first 2 years after that conversation in his study, I called him every Sunday afternoon at 3 p.m. Eastern. We talked about the Panthers. We talked about his garden. We talked about my career. We did not talk about Caroline, or the trust, or the Parkinsons. But Caroline noticed the Sunday calls. By the summer of 2020, Caroline had begun answering my father's phone when I called. She would tell me he was napping. She would tell me he was out. She would tell me he had just left for the store. Once, in September of 2020, I called and she told me my father was at the doctor. I called back 4 hours later. She told me he was at the doctor. I called back the next morning. She told me he was at the doctor. I stopped calling on Sundays. I started calling on Wednesday afternoons at 2 p.m., when I knew Caroline had her standing hair appointment on King Street. My father and I talked for 6 months on Wednesday afternoons. Then Caroline changed her hair appointment to Thursdays. By 2021, my father and I were communicating almost entirely through letters. He would mail me handwritten letters from a small post office in Mount Pleasant that Caroline did not know about. I would write him back to a P.O. box he had rented, in his name, that Caroline also did not know about. The letters were short. They were mostly about Cooper, the dog I had adopted the year before, and about the mountains, and about the small things a father and son who cannot speak on the phone say to each other when they only have paper. In one letter, in March of 2022, my father wrote, "James, Caroline told me last week that you had stopped calling because you were angry about the wedding. I did not correct her. I did not correct her, because I do not want her to know that I know. Please continue to be patient. Please continue to write. Your mother would be proud of the way you are handling this. Dad, I have that letter in a wooden box in my cabin. I read it about once a year." My father died on September 4th of this year. He was 71 years old. According to the death certificate, he died of complications from Parkinson's-related pneumonia. According to Caroline, he died surrounded by loving family. I found out he had died from a Facebook post. Caroline had posted a photograph of my father in his dress blues, along with a lengthy caption about her beloved husband and her devoted son David, who had been at his side every single day of his final illness. The post received 437 likes. It was shared 89 times. It ran, in edited form, in the obituary section of the Charleston Post and Courier the following Tuesday. I was not mentioned. Not once. Not by name. Not by relationship. The obituary listed my father's survivors as his loving wife Caroline and his devoted son David Preston. I did not exist. I found out about the funeral 3 days after it happened, when Harold Grierson, my father's lawyer, the man who had witnessed the trust in 2019, called my cell phone. He said, very quietly, "James, I am so sorry. I only just learned. Your father is gone." I asked him when the funeral was. He said, "Son, it was 3 days ago." I did not cry. I sat on the porch of my cabin. Cooper put his head on my knee. I sat there for about 4 hours, until it got dark. And then I went inside, and I did what my father had asked me to do 6 years earlier. I called Harold Grierson back. I said, Harold, when is the reading of the will? He said, Caroline has scheduled it for November 12th. In my office, in Charleston. I said, I'll be there. He said, James, she doesn't know about the trust. I need you to understand that. I said, I know. He said, I have not spoken about it in 6 years. Not to anyone. Not even to my partners. Your father instructed me that the trust was to remain undisclosed until the reading. I am telling you now, in the interest of full disclosure, that when I open the trust file on November 12th, Caroline is going to react. Badly. I said, Harold, my father knew that. I knew that. Let her react. Harold was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Son, I served with your father in 1991. I want you to know that. He was the finest officer I ever knew. And what has been done to you these last 6 years? What she has done. I want you to know that on November 12th, I will make sure your father's wishes are honored. Every single one of them. I thanked him. I hung up. I sat on my porch for the rest of the night. On November 11th, I drove down from Asheville to Charleston in my old Ford pickup truck. I stayed at a small motel on Highway 17. I wore a plain gray suit to the reading. I did not wear a tie. I did not wear anything that would signal to Caroline what was about to happen. I walked into Harold Grierson's office at 9:57 a.m. on November 12th. Caroline was already there. She was sitting next to David, her son, my stepbrother, at a mahogany conference table. She was wearing a black dress and a diamond bracelet. She was drinking coffee from a bone china cup. She saw me. She smiled the small, tight smile she had been giving me since 2018. She said, James, I'm so glad you could make it. Have a seat, dear. I sat down. And that is when Caroline crossed her legs, adjusted the bracelet on her wrist, and told the lawyer I had nothing. The reading Harold Grierson looked at Caroline for a long moment after she finished speaking. He did not react. He did not smile. He did not sigh. He simply looked at her the way a man looks at a chess piece that has just moved itself into a losing position. Then he turned to the file in front of him. He turned to the second page. He read for 11 seconds. He turned to the third page, the cream-colored one with the blue seal. He looked up. He said, Mrs. Whitfield, before we proceed, I need to ask your stepson a question. He turned to me. Mr. Whitfield, when was the last time you spoke to your father? I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could speak, Caroline laughed. It was a soft, tinkling laugh. She said, Harold, dear, why does it matter? James hadn't spoken to his father in years. Robert used to say, Harold held up a single finger. Caroline stopped talking. I have never, in my life, seen a wealthy Southern woman stop talking because of a finger. But Caroline Preston Whitfield stopped talking, because Harold Grierson had raised one finger, and something in his face had told her, for the first time in her life, that she was not the most powerful person in the room. Harold said, Mr. Whitfield, please answer the question. I said, August 27th of this year, 8 days before he died. He called me from a phone at his cardiologist's office, because he knew Caroline wouldn't be there. We spoke for 41 minutes. He told me he loved me. He told me he was proud of me. He told me to take care of Cooper. Harold said, and before that? I said, we spoke by phone approximately once a month, when the opportunity allowed. We wrote letters approximately twice a month. I have every letter he sent me, 237 letters in total, spanning from March of 2019 to July of 2025. Caroline's face had gone very still. She said, That's not possible. Robert didn't write letters. Harold said, Mrs. Whitfield, I'm going to ask you to hold your questions until I have finished reading the estate documents. Can you do that for me? Caroline nodded. Harold cleared his throat. He picked up the first document from the file. He said, This is the last will and testament of Robert James Whitfield, executed on April 4, 2018. This will governs the disposition of Colonel Whitfield's personal residence at 1247 Middle Street, Sullivan's Island, South Carolina, his personal effects and household goods, his vehicles, and his liquid financial assets held in accounts jointly with his wife, Caroline Preston Whitfield. He read the will. It took 8 minutes. The house went to Caroline. The cars went to Caroline. The joint accounts, which totaled, I would later learn, approximately $890,000, went to Caroline. There were small bequests, $50,000 to David, $25,000 to a Marine Corps scholarship fund, $10,000 to St. Michael's Episcopal Church. There was one line for me. It said, "To my son, James Robert Whitfield, I leave my dress uniform, my service medals, and my personal correspondence to be delivered to him by my attorney upon the reading of this will." Caroline smiled. She could not help it. Her whole face relaxed. She looked at David. David smiled back at her. She said, "Thank you, Harold. That's very thorough. Is there anything else?" Harold said, "Yes, Mrs. Whitfield, there is one additional document." He set down the will. He picked up the cream-colored page with the blue seal. He said, "This document is titled, The Whitfield Legacy Trust. It was established on January 18, 2019, by Colonel Robert James Whitfield, funded with premarital and inherited assets exempt from marital property under South Carolina Code Section 20-3630. It was witnessed by myself and by 2 attorneys of this firm. It has been held in confidence, per the settlor's explicit instructions, for 6 years and 10 months. Caroline said, What trust? Robert never mentioned a trust." Harold said, "The settlor's instructions were that the trust was to remain undisclosed to all parties, including the spouse, until the reading of the will." Caroline's voice went up half an octave. She said, "That's not legal. That's not legal, Harold. A husband cannot hide assets from his wife." Harold said, "Mrs. Whitfield, he was not required to disclose premarital and inherited assets during the marriage. They were his to dispose of, and he chose to place them in trust for his son." He turned the page. He said, "The trust contains the entirety of the Whitfield family commercial real estate holdings, 3 commercial properties in downtown Charleston, originally acquired by Colonel Whitfield's grandfather in 1962. Current appraised value, as of the fiscal year 2025 assessment, is $6.4 million. Caroline made a sound. Harold continued. "The trust also contains a life insurance settlement in the amount of $1.2 million, funded by a policy originally taken out on Colonel Whitfield by his first wife, Margaret Whitfield, in 1998, with James Whitfield as the sole beneficiary." Caroline said, No, Harold, no, that policy was." Harold said, "The trust further contains a portion of Colonel Whitfield's military retirement, directed into the trust monthly from January 2019 forward, totaling as of the date of his death, $478,000. Caroline stood up. She said, "Harold, this is fraud. This is fraud. He cannot. A husband cannot." Harold said, "Mrs. Whitfield, please sit down." She did not sit down. Harold said, in a voice I had not heard from him before, "Mrs. Whitfield, sit down. Now." She sat down. Harold said, "The total current value of the Whitfield Legacy Trust, as of this morning, is approximately $8.1 million. The sole trustee and sole beneficiary is James Robert Whitfield." He set the paper down. He looked at me. He said, "Son, your father asked me to read you one final line, upon the disclosure of this trust. It is not part of the legal document. It is a personal instruction he left in a sealed envelope for me to open on this date." "May I?" I nodded. Harold picked up a small white envelope. He opened it. He unfolded a single sheet of paper. He cleared his throat. He read, "James, if Harold is reading this, then I am gone. And Caroline has just told the room that you have nothing. She is wrong. You have everything I ever built. You have everything my father ever built. You have everything your mother ever prayed I would leave to the right person. Take care of it. Take care of Cooper. And remember, a Whitfield does not need to be at the funeral to be a son. He only needs to be the son. I love you, Dad." The conference room was completely silent. Caroline was crying. David was staring at the table. I stood up. I picked up my father's letter. I folded it. I put it in my inside coat pocket, and I walked out of the conference room without saying a single word. The aftermath: Caroline hired 3 separate law firms in the 6 weeks after the reading. 2 of them refused the case within the first week. The third, a firm out of Atlanta, took Caroline's retainer, filed a lawsuit contesting the trust on the grounds of spousal fraud and non-disclosure of marital assets, and was informed by Harold Grierson's office, within 11 days, that the trust had been established with entirely premarital and inherited assets, that South Carolina law explicitly protected such assets from spousal claims, and that any further litigation would be met with a countersuit for legal fees and defamation. The Atlanta firm withdrew from the case on December 3rd. Caroline stopped speaking to me, which was fine, because Caroline had never really started speaking to me in the first place. David called me twice. The first call, in late November, was to accuse me of stealing from his mother. I let him talk. When he was done, I said, "David, I'm going to say this once. Your mother spent 7 years telling my father I was estranged from him. Your mother wrote an obituary that erased me. Your mother came into that conference room and told a lawyer I had nothing. Your mother made her choices. I am not the person you should be calling. I hope you have a good Christmas." I hung up. The second call, in January, was different. David sounded tired. He said, "James, I owe you an apology. I didn't know about the letters. I didn't know about the Wednesday phone calls. Mom didn't tell me any of it. I thought you were the one who walked away. I'm sorry." I said, "David, I appreciate that. Take care of yourself." I did not say I forgave him. I have not yet decided whether I do. I have not been back to Charleston. I moved into the smallest of the 3 commercial properties in downtown Charleston, a 2-story brick building on East Bay Street that my great-grandfather bought in 1962 with money he earned working as a stevedore on the Charleston docks. I did not move into it, exactly. I hired a management company to run it, but I visited it in December. I stood in front of it for a long time. I looked up at the second-story windows. I thought about my great-grandfather. I thought about my father. I thought about the letter that had been read to me in Harold Grierson's office. A Whitfield does not need to be at the funeral to be a son. He only needs to be the son. I have not framed my father's letter. I keep it in the wooden box in my cabin, with the 237 letters from 2019 to 2025. Cooper is 9 years old now. His hips are starting to give him trouble. My vet says he has another 2, maybe 3 years. I have not decided what to do with the $8.1 million my father left me. I have donated a small portion, $200,000, to a scholarship fund at the Marine Corps University in Quantico, in my father's name. I have set aside another portion for Cooper's medical care and for a piece of land next to my cabin that I want to buy before somebody builds a house on it. The rest of it I am leaving alone. I am leaving it alone because my father did not leave it to me so that I could spend it. He left it to me because he trusted me to be the kind of man who did not need to. Last week, on a Thursday afternoon, I sat on my porch with Cooper. It was cold. The wind was moving through the pines behind the cabin. I was reading a letter my father had written me in October of 2020. A letter I had read maybe a dozen times before. At the end of the letter, in his tight, careful handwriting, my father had written, "James, when this is all over, and it will be over one day, I want you to know that I was proud of you every single day. Not because of the Marines, not because of the medals, because you were the son who kept his word. That is the rarest thing a man can be. Love, Dad." I folded the letter. I put it in the wooden box. I sat on my porch and I watched the sun go down over the mountains. And for the first time in 6 years, I felt like I could rest. If you have ever kept a promise that cost you your reputation, if you have ever been called ungrateful or estranged or the son who didn't show up, when the truth was locked in an envelope that only one man knew about, I want you to leave one word in the comments below. Just one word. The name of the person who knew the truth about you when nobody else did. Say their name, because someone in this comment section is going to read your word, and they're going to remember to write a letter to somebody they should have written to a long time ago. And if this story reminded you that quiet loyalty always outlasts loud lies, subscribe. Because next week, I'm telling you about a son-in-law who spent 5 years calling his wife's mother the crazy aunt. She wasn't crazy, she was a federal judge. I'll see you there.